breathing, especially in nature. It's one of the scariest places to be. If you're ever like going hiking and you get off the path and you even just get yourself turned around for like 30 seconds, if you're not used to that, there is such a panic that can set in. But at the same time, you're like fearing for your life, but you're surrounded by such beauty, and that's something that we really, really were aiming for. With me and Pierce Sturks, my director of photography, so many times we would almost elect to frame a more visually appealing shot than necessarily one that conveyed all the information necessary. Because that was like paramount for us to just have it be a very like visually arresting film as much as we could for, it being slasher film about a guy walking through the woods.
Very good. Carolyn, I want to come back to you. Why do you think this film is resonating with audiences?
I think because it's a fresh take, and I think that a lot of younger audiences, they don't know, they may not know about like some older films like, for instance, like Peeping Tom, or, some of those older films that have the POV of a killer. So I think this is really fresh and new for younger audiences. And I think specifically that you kind of, I think, Peter and Chris, like you've crossed the line with how, with the kills and like made them really creative. And I think that's kind of like the center point or the centerpiece of the film is like these really creative kills, but in like these natural settings that are specifically Canadian. I don't know if like, like the wood splitter, like that's...
The images we're conjuring for you.
Yes, I mean, we're creating more interest now for people to see it. I think that's what kind of blew people's minds because they're so inventive and they're so specifically Canadian, as Chris said, like it's specifically Canadian, and we need a boost. We really need a boost. Like we have the Cronenbergs, and I love them. Like they'll always stay in my heart forever. So, and they're creating their art, but I think this is, and we have a big cottage culture here, right? We have a big cottage culture here. So next time people go up to Muskoka or wherever they are and they have their cottage, they're going to think twice about taking that hike. So I think that really resonates with people.
Very nice. You mentioned David Cronenberg.
Yeah.
I'm coming to you, Alex. He is obviously now one of Canada's most celebrated filmmakers, but when you look at his first film, Shivers, released in 1975, let's just say wasn't a huge fan. A lot of people weren't a huge fan of it. Can you tell us about that? What was a little bit of sort of negative reviews?
Yeah, so Shivers, which was also known as the Parasite Murders, takes place in an apartment complex, and there are these parasites that get transmitted through sex, so it's kind of seedy, it's kind of scary, it's very much a B movie in a way that only Cronenberg can do, because there's a lot of incredible themes and issues that emerge throughout the film. However, it was funded by the then CFDC, which is now Telefilm Canada. So it came from a lot of taxpayer dollars, and a lot of people weren't happy about that, where they felt like they were essentially making a smut film with taxpayer money. So there's a really famous article in the magazine Saturday Night, and it was written by Robert Fulford, and the title of the article was something like, "You should know how bad this movie is after all you paid for it."
Correct.
And it was like this incredible moral panic that essentially completely disrupted how Canada was starting to build up their film industry. And then they moved into the tax shelter era, where people could, invest in films, get 100% back of their investment against their taxes. And so there was this real panic around it. And Cronenberg just, he kept calm, carried on, made some of the most indelible cinematic images I've ever seen, and has always been a bit of a provocateur, like even down to, if you look at his 1996 film Crash, which, there was so much speculation it was going to win the Palme d'Or at Cannes that year, and then Francis Ford Coppola, who was the jury head of that year, apparently hated it and did not want to award it, so the rest of the jury had to give him a special award, and like Coppola refused to hand it to him, like all of this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, he's Canadian.
We have miraculously been spared from the animosity Cronenberg experience.
I think
it demonstrates like the shift in kind of how horror has been embraced in the mainstream. That, you know, the stuff that you see on The Walking Dead and on primetime is as gnarly as you know, horror films were in the 70s and 80s, and now it's primetime television. And I certainly think that Chris and I and Shannon and the whole team, when we were making this film, we definitely did want to cross the line in a few places and show stuff and show horror in ways that I don't think is necessarily that distinct from other stuff that's out there, but we're doing it in a different way that we hoped would be disarming and would be simply different and a new perspective and unique. And Nash, maybe Chris can speak to a bit about how those...
Well, I actually want to pick up with you, Peter, because you had mentioned sort of newer audiences who may not be familiar, but there's a whole audience here who may not know how deep Canada's history is with horror. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know we mentioned off the top Black Christmas.
Yeah, which, I mean, in a sense, Black Christmas, Bob Clark's Black Christmas, and Bob Clark, honorary Canadian, and I'd like to say, he kind of invented the genre of the slasher film in which we're interrogating and investigating with this film. But, I mean, we spoke about Cronenberg, and really the fact that, you know, Canadian taxpayers are kind of responsible for, in many ways, for the Canadian wave, because we had this whole tax shelter era where there was a lot of incentive for investment in Canadian productions, and the productions that turned out to be the most commercial were horror films. And so we had a whole wave of great Canadian horror, from Rituals to Death Weekend. Trying to think of some of my other favorites, but it's been consistent all the way across. And it's interesting too, especially in Ontario, which was also a very repressed province when it came to horror cinema. A lot of horror cinema got cut and censored here, but I think that only fueled, you know, anytime you repress art anywhere, I feel like it only means you're now going to see a wave of art from that community.
Very interesting. Chris, I want to ask you this, and I'll follow up with Caroline on that. Has Canada gotten more supportive of its horror filmmakers, or does the genre still face a stigma?
I would say it doesn't. I think it's pretty, as Pete was saying, it's a very mainstream genre at this point. I think, you know, as far as like films in production, it's always going to be a hard road making a movie regardless. But I think like public support is definitely there for a horror film and the genre in general. And even I feel like just with the amount of media that we're exposed to these days, there's a larger appetite for something a little more transgressive, a little more off the beaten path, even just like to try it out, even just to sample it and see like what people are into. I feel like everyone is a lot more apt to do that these days.
Caroline, get you to pick up on that as well.
You know, I program for 2 film festivals, and I watch a lot of horror. And I think there is support within the community. Like, I see a lot of filmmakers and producers supporting each other. So I think that's really important. I think the funders are kind of catching up. They need a bit more work. Like I know with Blood in the Snow, we have a development lab for underrepresented filmmakers. And that, we've been seeing some progress. Like, we're seeing some of the projects that are pitched get telephone funding. And, you know, it's actually a little bit more accelerated now. We're really surprised, and it's really kind of encouraging to see that. So I do think it is getting more support, and definitely with viewers, like audiences. Like, people will watch the worst horror if you're at home. Like, you'll sit there and you'll, you know, let me just put something on.
Right.
I do it myself. Like, and you can't say that there's a bad horror film because someone's put their heart and soul in it. Right. And some of them are, okay, sure, they're not going to win an Oscar, but they're fun. And I think that's the aspect that people are kind of maybe looking for now, is something fun.
Okay, I actually want to pick up on that, and let's talk about some of the elements that sort of go into some horror films. Alex, what themes are prevalent in Canadian horror films?
Well, there's been so much writing about the Canadian aesthetic, the Canadian ethos. I believe it was Margaret Margaret Atwood, who talked about, due to the size of our land and our limited population and the extremity of our weather on both ends, we tend to kind of have a bunker mentality. Right. We tend to hunker down. And so I always feel like when I watch Canadian horror, it's about something emerging, whereas a lot of American horror is about something returning home, like The Return of the Repressed, that was Robin Wood. If you look at Europe, it's a lot of history, a lot of folklore. Australia is maybe the most similar in its kind of adversarial nature with its own outback. But in Canada, it's like there's something within the soil that is kind of out there to get us, and it's going to reemerge. And, as soon as I saw In a Violent Nature, I was like, yep, here it is. It is emerging from our soil once again to get us. And I think that's why it speaks to our fear of, nature.
All right. Actually, Chris, as a local, I want to know, Northern Ontario, where does it stack in sort of setting up a horror movie? I don't think I am ever going to go into a cabin anymore in the middle of the woods, but where do we stack up in terms of other locations? Obviously, we know Toronto is a popular spot and other places, but...
Oh, I think that's all entirely dependent on the tax credits. So pretty well, shoot in Northern Ontario. Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, it was really important to shoot there, not just for the nostalgia's sake, but it is like an overwhelming place to be. And it was important for me, like, to even like travel out to these remote locations and to shoot remotely, just so everybody feels it, like right through them. So, no matter who's on set, whether it's the makeup or the DP or the actors, like just feeling that we were out in the middle of nowhere brought something to the film. I don't think you're going to get that specific flavor of isolation in other places. I mean, it's Canada, right? So every piece of this country has its own flavor of isolation. But yeah, Northern Ontario is a towering isolation, I would suppose.
All right, with that, and this is my favorite part, as I was discussing with you guys off camera, not a huge horror fan. I scare easily, but I do want, and I'm hoping our audience can, if they're looking for a scary movie to enjoy this summer, where should they be looking? So Alex, I want to come to you first.
Ooh, there's so many amazing ones, but thinking, In a Violent Nature, the same kind of area as Chris just described it, but I've got to say, like, Adam McDonald's Paiwacket is such a creepy film. If you love the aesthetic of In a Violent Nature, it definitely has some of that as well, but a very different kind of supernatural flavor to it, and a whole mother-daughter relationship, which is so beautifully realized.
All right, now we actually do have the trailer for Paiwacket, so if we could play it.
I charge you with this sign. Mother and the night are mine. I invite you to come. Paiwacket. Get away!
Paiwacket can take many forms.
Where'd you go?
Don't trust your lying eyes.
I can't believe you wanted to kill your own mother.
Live. Just let me in. Just open the door.
All right, so we got a little taste there. Can you give us a little summary, a little bit of what Paiwacket?
Gosh, it's as a former teen girl, sometimes you just don't get along with your parents, and sometimes you make a deal with the wrong demon.
We've all been there.
We've all been there. Okay,
right?
fair enough.
Who hasn't? It's Canada. But yeah, so it's basically about this girl who has a very extreme reaction to some decisions her mother has made, and it sets her on this kind of strange occultist path that doesn't go as well as she'd hoped. And Adam McDonald's made a few movies. He also made the series Slasher, which also starred David Cronenberg in one of the series.
And Backcountry, right?
And Backcountry, I mean.
So definitely a filmmaker who's also, I think, like our movie, kind of interested in the relationship between and civilization.
And what's great about Paiwacket in particular is it has this whole kind of heavy metal, like punk rock attitude to it. So it also feels really edgy and even more subversive than so many other films that have tried to do something similar. So it also really scared scared me.
I only watched the trailers and I was already like,
Yeah.
all right, we got to take a break. So Carolyn, I know you've got a film here that you're reckoning Slashback.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. We do have the trailers. Actually, let's watch the trailer first and then we'll get a little summary from you. So let's play that.
What is it? Emergency!
I feel like I can get behind this one. This one feels a little more family friendly, but there is still some horror. Tell us a little bit about this one.
Well, if you like that movie Attack the Block, you'll love Slashback because this is our Canadian version. So it's about a group of kids in a remote northern town. They're just adorable kids. They're in their town and they're being attacked by some sort of alien entity that possesses the townspeople, and they have to come together to fight these monsters. And what I love about this film is that there's these little girls, they're kind of looking for their identity, finding their place in the world, and they all come together to kick ass. And that's basically it. It's funny, it's charming. The kids are adorable.
An Indigenous filmmaker.
An Indigenous filmmaker, yes, Nyla Nukchuk. And I just think it's just a blast. It's a lot of fun, and you get behind the kids. It's exciting, too, and you can watch it with kids.
I like that.
They'll love it.
Fighting back instead of running away.
Yes.
I like that. All right, Chris.
I'm going to have to pull the hometown card and recommend Rituals, Peter Carter's Rituals. It was actually shot in very close to the same area that we shot In a Violent Nature. And growing up, it took me a while to watch it. It's very much in an exploitation film coming off the heels of Deliverance with Hal Holbrook, a group of doctors go out into the woods for a weekend of hunting and camping, and there's some people in the woods that want revenge for some reason. And yeah, it's just another movie that shows off the Ontario wilderness, especially that area that we shot in. Much like Paiwacket too. Paiwacket was actually shot in the same area. So yeah, I would say Rituals.
And I would shout out to Batchwana Bay if I'm right on that one.
Yeah.
So there you go. All right, and then Peter.
I mean, every day I'll have a different answer. I can't even remember if I prepared a clip for any of these. But I love Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum, Bruce McDonald's.
Good.
Pontypool, and also what I love about horror is that it's so flexible. There's funny horror, there's scary horror, there's bad horror in the sense that this movie is maybe incompetently put together, but because so much of horror comes with you understanding the rules of the genre when you enter into it. When you see something not work and not fit together, it can be incredibly entertaining. Like Andrew Jordan's Things, for instance, one of my favorite B movies that feels like kind of a fever dream when you watch it.
Tell us a little bit about that one.
About Things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Things. Things is like a movie that was found in a bunker buried underground, and it might have been made by aliens. But Andrew Jordan, Barry Gillis, they were trying to make a movie that was going to be like their Evil Dead, and it's about two friends that are spending a night in a cabin in the woods, as so many of these movies do, and the wife of one of their friends bursts forth these alien entities that look like these ants that start running around the house, and they just kind of have a bad night. And we have a great time watching it, but it's just very surreal. At one point, the sound kind of cuts out of the film, and there's like 8 minutes of silence, and I call it, cinematic purgatory, where you just kind of don't understand if you're watching a movie now or if you've fallen asleep and have entered some kind of dream state. But every minute of this movie is just hilarious in how just absurd and eccentric it is. I really adore Things, and I think it's maybe one of the worst movies ever made, but at that point, by that metric, I feel like that's something to be proud of, that Canada has created one of the worst films and I think one of the best films ever.
All right. So we have a couple minutes left and I have a couple questions. One thing I have to ask is, you all watch a lot of horror movies, but Alex, I want to come to you. Do you still get scared watching them, and why do you do that? Why do you do that to yourself?
Well, I think horror is a really incredible space for so much of what our society represses. Our world is really scary right now. It's really challenging to have really direct conversations about so many of the issues in our society can be really confronting, and a lot of people don't want to deal with that. We need to, but it's really hard to. And I think horror, in many ways, gives us a language in which to talk about these things through metaphors, through monsters. We're able to start to kind of pick apart our fears and understand them a bit better, and understand ourselves better, and hopefully our community around us a bit better. So I think that's why it's like each generation we produce a new set of filmmakers, and it's like I can't wait to see what the next generation is going to do, what our generation is still going to do. It's really incredible. I mean, Cronenberg's he's still making stuff, he's still iconic, he's still pissing people off.
All right. Carolyn, how about you? Like, why do you love these movies?
I just, for some reason, they make me feel safe, if that's a weird thing to say, because you're watching them. Yeah, you're watching them at home. You're not really engaging in the actual action. You're watching people get slashed, or the monster appears, and it really is. It's a projection of what you're afraid of. Like, I do love a good horror mockumentary, like The Conspiracy. You've got it. That one freaks me out every time because it's so well done. You're like, is this real? Or there's another one called Fake Blood. It's another Canadian mockumentary. And they kind of walk that line between reality and horror. And you realize that it's not so far off from what you're living. So, there's those sort of things that freak me out. But I do feel comforted by horror. I don't know. It's weird.
All right. We've got about a minute left. Chris, or I'm going to go Peter, and then we're going to end off on Chris.
I just think horror is just such a terrific canvas, as you were saying, to explore ideas. It's also a genre that I find doesn't have to be as didactic. You watch a movie like Get Out. If that film was a drama, I don't think it would have had the impact it had. But because it was placed in a genre that is entertaining, that the audience also understands how this works, but can be still surprised, I think that is part of it. A lot of my relationship with horror is I still get scared I'm always chasing scares, because certainly I get used to certain genres and certain types of routines, and I'm just looking for the interesting choices, the things that are going to disarm me or disrupt my expectations, and I like losing that control just for a second.
Right.
And then as you said, recognize you're still on the couch, I'm still fine, I'm still safe, I survived.
Very nice. Chris, I actually have a rather different question for you. Of course, the love is there for this movie. That's why you would do something so crazy like the film you did, but you're having such a nice success with this movie and receiving a lot of praise. What do you want to do next?
Live comfortably. I'll say that. Yeah, still working on that one. But probably just still playing within the genre. Just anything. I always just have I've leaned towards more transgressive cinema and transgressive storytelling. So not really sure exactly where that's going to take me, but I just always like exploring those kind of ideas. So whatever happens next, it's going to be there.
Very nice. Hopefully somewhere in the woods in a cabin with a beautiful scenic backdrop. All right. We are going to leave it there. Chris, Peter, Alexandra, Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Lovely discussion. Hopefully our viewers and listeners haven't been too spooked after the discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Always looking for more about what's going on at Queen's Park? Nerd Out with Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath and the On Poly podcast. Fridays on the agenda, anytime on TVO.org or the podcast platform of your choice.
Growing up here felt a little bit like living in a Gothic novel, I do have to admit. It was like a Bronte sister or something, having a forest to explore and green grass and water and trees. And then there's this beautiful creek, and this creek was called Spring Creek, and it in the 1800s was considered to bring long life to someone if they drank from it. And so a little hotel propped up in the town as it was being formed, and people would come from all over Ontario to drink from Spring Creek. Horror movies are something that I love. I'm a big fan of it. I enjoy participating in movies and horror novels and things that are a little bit spooky and scary. And so I wanted to take a look at moments in my life where I connected with a trope that is common in scary movies or scary literature. So those moments where my story might illuminate a universal issue rather than the other way around.
And on this warm spring night, we have the moon roof open and the windows down, and we are all chair dancing and singing to George Michael's Freedom 90.
The George Michael Freedom 90 video said something to me about how even in secret places, like your own bathroom, your own bed sheets, the places you're half naked and vulnerable, you are always first and foremost queer. And that means you're never alone because, like the Borg in TNG, we're a collective consciousness. We can recognize each other through our gaydar. Now, of course, hiding and being invisible are two different things. Hiding is fear-based, but invisibility can be a superpower. At least that's what I was contemplating at the time, because I was scared to make my queerness visible to my friends and the world, afraid I would scare them. My bi-ness was not supermodel beautiful to me yet. I was afraid they wouldn't understand. I wasn't interested in Linda Evangelista. I was already swooning over pictures of a shaven-headed Ripley in David Fincher's next project that was coming out a month later in 1992, Alien 3. And it was a love that was growing desperate to burst out of my chest. Being a queer woman and feeling that strong affinity for horror films or thrillers or scary bits and pieces of culture that come up. The reason why it felt so prevalent for me in this time period, the 80s and 90s, was, we were really taught to be very hypervigilant around anyone who seemed to be hiding part of their nature out in public, like the Ted Bundys of the world, who were so wonderful at front and then were hiding something. And in the case of gays and lesbians, people were hiding something, but it wasn't something frightening. It was something beautiful. It was love that we were hiding, and yet people turned it to become something more villainous. And that's why they used queer characters quite often. If you look at the queer coding, it's quite often the characters who are the villains are queer coded in life. And so that's a strong connection that happens often. In the calls coming from inside the house, the essays are all outlined underneath common tropes in film and literature. And so I take that trope, so for instance, the babysitter, and I look at a moment in my life when I was the babysitter and all of the kind of nerves that came with it and all of the moments that were a little bit spooky or strange that came with it, the stress that came with being responsible for children. And then I look at some of the theory behind it and I compare it to films that are within that genre and try and connect it to illuminate a stronger universal truth.
At 18, all I want to do is drive. I'm in mad, passionate love with the freedom that it presents, and my mother lends me the car because she never seems to want me to take the bus. She doesn't say anything to me outright about the risks and dangers of the world. I think she knows that if she said something to me that I'd just roll my eyes at her so hard that I'd do a cartwheel. I think our being attacked or something, it seems about as likely to happen to us as a man with a hook for a hand climbing through my bathroom mirror. But for a long time now on the news, girls like as young as 15 have been followed home by a man from bus stops near Scarborough.
I think that Gen X, absolutely, growing up in this time period, definitely, that is where my worldview comes from. And for this particular book, it fit in perfectly with the film and television and exploring things through that trope, because we were the TV generation, right? We were typically the latchkey kids who were growing up on MTV and coming home from school and watching Young and the Restless, and a lot of us were. And so that is part of it. Media and connecting with media was a big part of our education, I think, especially for me during the teenage years and formative years. So, I'm curious about how that impacted me and my thoughts and what lessons I learned from it. So Gen Xers now at the certain age that we're at, I'm looking back at the first half of my life and kind of assessing the collateral damage. Although as a mother and cis femme queer woman, I've struggled with centering my stories and experiences, separating the expectations of my role from the individual being, and as they say in the film Orlando, not drowning anonymously in the milk of female kindness. We must stay sweet, calm, and sheltered.
The stereotype of a screaming teenage girl exists because teenage girls have valid reasons to scream. And teenage girls need plenty of healthy opportunities to scream together in fun. So when we need to scream in outrage or fear, our voices are prepared.
I'm a mother raising two daughters, one who's just about to become a teenager and one who's right in the thick of it. And they are both absolutely informed and intelligent and capable girls. But I worry that what maybe I've done is swing the pendulum too far and, by frightening them a little bit. I think they definitely don't fall into some of the same things that I do, but every generation has their issues and concerns. And, I worry that maybe where I was naive, maybe they are too well informed, and it could be frightening or negative to have too much information. Just like I feel like growing up in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, I didn't have enough at all. My fertility journey was, it was almost Tolkien. It was so epic. It was very long. It took a lot in order to bring our two children into the world. So there were multiple miscarriages, lots of different doctors involved. I had several surgeries, even when I was pregnant at one point in time. And then in between to make sure that the next pregnancy would stay. And it was, a lot of bed rest. So there's something kind of gothic around being on bed rest. But I think it's really important to share your fertility journey because so many people are going through it. And because we don't and didn't talk about it, I know for myself, it felt very isolating. I imagine for my partner at the time, it also felt very isolating not being able to have a voice as the partner. Everything is, it's all about the mother the gestational mother who's going through it and not so much for the partner. So there's a little bit about that I think needs to be spoken about. And then, there are parts of me where I kind of question how deep we went into that, how much it cost us, how much was required, and how much were we sort of led down a path to try and do this in a particular way. What was necessary, what wasn't. The costs were extraordinary to our, bank account, but also the relationship, my career, taking time off for all of that, your sanity and sense of self. It was all-encompassing for a very long time. And so, I want people to know that they're not alone in that. And I think also giving a voice to queer women and how we go about creating our families as well is unique and specific to our journey. At first, we had thought to ourselves, how are we going to do this to women? How's that going to happen? And then there were so many options and opportunities, which you don't really think about, to create this family. And so finding the right path for us, was a bit of a challenge. But ultimately, I would do it again every single day for the rest of my life to have the kids that I have, because they're phenomenal. This essay is really the impetus for the calls coming from inside the house, and it's from the New York Times Sunday Style section, November 1st, 2020. And it is an essay about living in a potentially haunted house at the end of my marriage, so living with ghosts post-divorce. Who is the Harbinger? So the Harbinger is one of the tropes that I explore in the book, and the Harbinger is the character at the beginning of a horror movie who fuels up the plot line by stepping in and saying, don't go into the woods, or stay away from Camp Blood in Friday the 13th. The Harbinger is the person who knows the landscape and warns the protagonist to be careful of what's about to come. And in the book, I personify that character as my anxiety. So for me, I live with generalized anxiety disorder that developed significantly when I was going through the fertility process, trying to have children. And so this character of the Harbinger hung around for some time until I decided to deal with it and go on to medication, which has now really, really supported me and helped me with some of the physical sensations of anxiety, so I don't feel like I'm tense at all times, but the intrusive thoughts still come in. And it's something that I think people are becoming more comfortable talking about, intrusive thoughts and fears and worries that are cycling through at all times. So for me, anxiety and the Harbinger really showed his face after I had the children and became a single mother when our family structure changed. And so at the times I was parenting, I was a single mother. So yeah, he would be very vocal about letting me know that, the worst things in the world could happen at any moment. My ex-wife and I used to call it death at every corner. So I could walk into a room and just let you know immediately where all of the dangers are. Some traumas are so big that they won't fit up on a shelf or in our curio cabinets. Some are so big we have to carry them with us 24/7, which can be awfully heavy. So we turn them into stories that are easier to share with others and take some of the load off of ourselves for a while. We make them entertaining so they're less likely to traumatize someone else. So that segment is in a story called The Storytellers, and it's The Storyteller, or My Dad's First Murder. My father was not a murderer. He's a journalist in the 1950s in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And so he is a very dynamic man, and he's wonderful with words, and he certainly is where I got my love of writing from. Growing up with a father who was a journalist and writer and a mother who was a teacher, literacy was very important to them. And so we had the great fortune of having access to books and the classics. So instead of bedtime stories, my father would read to us from An Invitation to Poetry, and read stories and poems like The Cremation of Sam McGee, which is one of my absolute favorites. So a little bit spooky and maybe not the most appropriate for bedtime, but it was always fun and got me interested in stories that were maybe a little bit on the darker side. The story of his first murder is he was a journalist. He was doing the crime beat, and he was listening to the police scanner on the radio, and they said, there's a body on Vernon Street. There's a body on Vernon Street. And they were calling for another police officer, and my dad realized, oh my God, I'm on Vernon Street. He was only 17 years old. He'd never seen a dead body before. He had never been a part of anything like this, and so he pulled up and stood over this body in the middle of the street and felt utterly terrified and got back into the car and drove off, and then came back once the police had arrived. I mean, that's kind of the gist of the story. Stories are so big and complex and tell so much about who the storyteller is as a human being. And, you know, when it comes to telling a great story, you need a little bit of both facts and fiction and fun, and a little bit of elaboration and a little bit of fabulousness in it, I think, to make the story really, really perfect. We lost my mom. She passed away in April of last year on my birthday, actually, which sounds really sad, but there was something quite beautiful about that too. Something about, you know, being there for each other in the moment of birth and death, and it was quite beautiful, actually. My mother had an illness called multiple systems atrophy, and it's a rare neurodegenerative disease, and like I could compare it to ALS, I suppose, where just she slowed down quite gently over a period of years, but eventually she was unable to really speak. She had to be fed. My mom was once a dancer. I say she remembered the dance, but she couldn't get her feet to move, and she you know, knew all the words to the songs, but she just couldn't quite sing them the way she could before. So she was a beautiful woman, a very gentle and peaceful spirit in my life. I say in the book that my mom did disappear from my life sort of task by task, and that maybe that's the responsibility of all moms, is to disappear from our children's life slowly, and as they take on each task in their life, to let them step forward into the spotlight and move back step by step. Smart stories for queer girls. I wasn't really writing it specifically for queer women, although I'm sure it will resonate for women who, you know, are queer, bi, lesbian, trans, wherever you are in the beautiful rainbow spectrum. You know, there's definitely stories in there for women. I've been really surprised and interested to see that men are really enjoying this book. I've had several reviews from men who have really kind of connected with it, and that was surprising to me. I thought for sure this would be strictly for women, but I was on a terrific podcast called Spooked, and they had read it and you loved it. I was like, that's interesting, okay. And then another reviewer who was male also. So it's not just specifically for queer women, and it's not specifically for women. It's not specifically for Gen X. When I was writing it, I did not have an ideal audience in mind. I try to put that out of my mind actually entirely. I try to put the business of writing a book out of my mind when I'm writing the book, so that it can be as authentic to the story that I want to tell as possible.
That is the agenda for Monday, September 2nd. Tomorrow, Steve Paikin is back to kick off season 19 of The Agenda. He'll get us caught up on the eventful summer in provincial politics and all things Queen's Park. I'm Jane Jaganaldan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and have a happy Labor Day.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose. Be informed.
It is unclear how many undocumented immigrants live in Canada.
Seek understanding.
Over 100 heat records were broken in Canada last week.
Hear